The ghosts of Mohatta Palace, Karachi's haunted palace. There are buildings that preserve history in books, and then there are buildings that seem to preserve something much older, something that cannot be photographed, catalogued, or explained. In Karachi, Sindh, one such place is the magnificent Mohatta Palace. Standing in the historic Clifton area, the palace is one of Karachi's most recognizable landmarks. Official records confirm that it was built in 1927 as the seaside residence of Rai Bahadur Seth Shivratan Mohatta, a wealthy Maori businessman. Designed by architect Ahmed Hussein Argar, the palace combined yellow Gizri stone with pink Jodhpur stone and drew heavily on Mughal and Rajput architectural traditions. During daylight, Mohatta Palace is difficult to imagine as a frightening place. Its elaborate stonework, domes, balconies, gardens, and imposing walls give it the appearance of a royal residence rather than a haunted building. But after sunset, the same architecture takes on another character. The corridors become long shadows. The decorative windows become dark openings. Footsteps can echo through empty rooms, and the enormous palace can suddenly feel strangely isolated despite being surrounded by one of Karachi's busiest urban areas. The palace's history itself is enough to make the imagination wander. Mohatta lived there with his family during the final decades of British India. After partition in 1947, the building changed hands and purposes. According to the museum's official history, the newly formed government of Pakistan acquired the palace and used it to house the country's first Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Later, it became associated with Mohatta Fatima Jinnah, the sister of Muhammad Ali Jinnah. Eventually, after decades of complicated history, the building became a museum and opened to the public in September 1999. It is this long succession of occupants, political events, departures, deaths, and years of uncertainty that helped create the palace's supernatural reputation. But it is important to separate documented history from folklore. There is no reliable historical evidence proving that Mohatta Palace is genuinely haunted. The stories of ghosts and supernatural encounters are local legends and reported experiences rather than established facts. Nevertheless, these stories have become an important part of the palace's modern reputation. Among the most frequently repeated stories are accounts from people who have worked around the building after dark. According to haunted place accounts, guards and staff have sometimes described hearing unexplained voices, laughter, or sounds coming from apparently empty sections of the palace. Others have claimed that objects seem to have moved from where they were originally placed. These stories are also repeated by Chakar Ventures, which lists Mohatta Palace among Pakistan's reportedly haunted locations and describes claims involving unexplained movement of objects and voices in empty halls. Imagine being the security guard responsible for the palace late at night. The museum is closed. The visitors have disappeared. The doors have been locked. Outside, Karachi continues to breathe, cars moving through distant streets, the wind coming from the direction of the sea, and the occasional sound of a vehicle passing through Clifton. Inside, however, there is almost complete silence. At first, the silence would probably feel peaceful. Then you hear a sound. A faint footstep. You stop walking. Nothing. You continue down the corridor. Another sound comes from behind you. You turn around, expecting to see another guard. There is nobody there. That is the type of atmosphere in which the legends of Mohatta Palace have survived. One of the palace's most persistent mysteries is not even a ghost story. It is the legend of an underground passage. Historical and media accounts have described a commonly repeated story about a tunnel supposedly connecting the palace to the nearby Sri Ratnaswar Mahadev temple. According to the legend, the passage was constructed so that Mohatta's wife could travel to the temple without having to walk outside. The story has been discussed for years, although details about the tunnel remain surrounded by uncertainty and folklore. The existence of such a legend adds another layer to the palace's mysterious reputation. A grand mansion. Underground passages. Religious history. Political history. Years of changing ownership. Long periods of uncertainty. And, eventually, stories about unexplained sounds and apparitions. It is easy to understand how these elements became intertwined. But the strangest stories concern the palace after midnight. Some accounts say guards have reported feeling that they were not alone while patrolling the building. Nothing necessarily appears in front of them. Instead, there is a sensation, a sudden awareness that someone is standing somewhere nearby. The feeling may disappear when another person arrives, only to return when the guard is alone again. These reports are sometimes described as a presence. There is no photograph that proves such a presence exists. There is no scientific investigation that has established a supernatural entity living inside the palace. Yet the story continues because the people telling it insist that the feeling is different from ordinary fear. It is the feeling of being watched. Another legend connects the palace's supernatural reputation to the British Raj era. Some accounts claim that guards have sensed or encountered spirits associated with the colonial period. These claims remain unverified, but they have become part of the folklore surrounding Mohatta Palace. Karachi Insider, for example, records rumors involving British-era ghosts and nighttime experiences reported by guards, while noting that the claims are unverified. There is something particularly unsettling about the idea of a palace remembering the people who once lived inside it. For decades, Mohatta Palace was not a museum. It was a home. People ate there. They slept there. They celebrated there. They argued there. Servants moved through the corridors. Visitors entered through its doors. Children may have run through its rooms. Important political figures later occupied the building. Government officials worked there. Fatima Jinnah lived there. And after all those lives passed through the palace, the building remained. Perhaps that is why the ghost stories feel believable to some visitors. The palace does not look dead. It looks as though it is waiting. The history surrounding Fatima Jinnah has also contributed to the atmosphere surrounding the building. She became associated with Mohatta Palace during the post-partition period, when the property was used as her residence. The official museum history confirms her connection to the palace. Her presence gives the building another deeply important historical layer, although there is no credible evidence that her spirit haunts the palace. Years later, when the palace was restored and transformed into a museum, thousands of visitors began walking through the same rooms where earlier generations had lived and worked. The building became a place of art, history, and cultural preservation. The official museum describes it today as a museum dedicated to the fine and decorative arts of Pakistan and the region. Yet the ghost stories did not disappear. That is perhaps the most fascinating part. The palace changed. Its purpose changed. Its owners changed. Its political significance changed. But the legends remained. One version of the story says that a guard walking through the palace late at night heard what sounded like quiet conversation coming from a room that he knew was empty. He approached the doorway and listened. Their voices seemed to disappear. He opened the door. Nothing. No people. No movement. Only darkness and furniture. He closed the door and walked away. Then, behind him, came the sound of laughter. He turned. The door was still closed. Stories like this cannot be independently verified, but they illustrate why the palace has acquired its reputation. The building itself provides an extraordinary setting for such tales: enormous rooms, stone corridors, architectural details that create unusual echoes, and a history stretching across nearly a century. There is another possibility that makes the palace even more interesting. Perhaps the ghosts do not need to be real for the stories to feel real. Old buildings produce strange sounds. Wind moves through openings. Temperature changes cause materials to expand and contract. Sound travels unpredictably through corridors. Shadows can appear where there were none moments earlier. A guard working alone at night is naturally more alert to every noise. But knowing these explanations does not necessarily make the experience less frightening. Imagine standing alone beneath one of Mohatta Palace's domes at 2 a.m. You know there is a perfectly reasonable explanation for every sound. You know the building is old. You know the wind is moving through the architecture. You know shadows can deceive the eyes. Then you hear footsteps approaching. 1. 2. 3. They stop directly outside the room. You wait. Nothing happens. You slowly open the door. The corridor is empty. That is the moment when rational explanations become difficult to remember. Mohatta Palace also has another fascinating chapter in its history, the long period during which the building was caught up in legal and administrative complications before its transformation into a museum. The palace was eventually acquired by a public trust in 1995, restored, and opened as the Mohatta Palace Museum in 1999. Today, the palace is not an abandoned ruin. It is a functioning cultural institution. The museum officially describes itself as a place intended to preserve and celebrate the cultural heritage of Pakistan and the region. That fact is important because many internet stories portray Mohatta Palace as though it were permanently deserted and inaccessible, which is not accurate. The frightening reputation exists alongside the real historical institution. And perhaps that contrast makes the story even better. During the day, visitors come to admire art. At night, legends return. There is no verified record proving that ghosts walk through Mohatta Palace. There is no scientific confirmation of supernatural activity. The museum itself does not establish the haunting stories as historical fact. What does exist is a collection of repeated local accounts, stories of strange sounds, moved objects, feelings of unseen presences, and rumors surrounding the palace's underground passage. But sometimes the most enduring horror stories are not the ones that can be proven. They are the ones that survive because generation after generation keeps telling them. Mohatta Palace has survived almost a century of history. It witnessed the final years of British India. It survived partition. It passed from private residence to government property. It became associated with the country's early foreign ministry. It became the residence of one of Pakistan's most important historical figures. It stood through years of uncertainty. And eventually, it became a museum. Through all those transformations, the palace itself remained. Its walls remained. Its underground legends remained. And the stories of strange sounds and nighttime encounters remained. So if you ever stand outside Mohatta Palace in Karachi during the evening, look carefully at its upper windows. During the day, they are simply architectural features of a magnificent historic building. At night, they can look like dark eyes staring back across Clifton. Maybe there is nothing behind them. Maybe every sound has a natural explanation. Maybe every shadow is simply a trick of light. But if you ever hear footsteps behind you when you know you are completely alone, do not immediately assume that the building is empty. Because according to the legends of Mohatta Palace, that is exactly when the palace becomes most alive. And perhaps the most frightening question is not whether Mohatta Palace is haunted. It is this. After nearly 100 years of people entering its doors, leaving its rooms, and disappearing into history, how much of the past could a building possibly remember?